We're exploring the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis from both sides, Soviets and American, Kennedy and Khrushchev. It was one of the most dangerous moments in history in October 1962, when nuclear war almost broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union. I'm the nephew of President John F. Kennedy, and my father, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, served as a key advisor during the missile crisis.
And I'm the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, chairman of the Soviet Union, who thought that he could put Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuba in secret in October 1962. This is the story of two men, one a seasoned political leader and a master of the bluff.
The other, a realistic idealist who sought to rebuild relations between the superpowers. Over 10 episodes, we're looking at what drove these two men and how what began as a secret mission almost spiraled out of control. The two leaders pulled the world back from the abyss of nuclear devastation, but only just. Welcome to The Bomb.
Moscow's Kievsky railway station. A crowd of thousands wave as Premier Nikita Khrushchev leaves on board a dark green steam train. He's heading for Vienna. It's a journey of more than 1,000 miles. In Kiev, his arms are filled with flowers. In a sunny Prague, more clapping crowds. As his train passes through the countryside of the communist world, he is waved on enthusiastically.
President John F. Kennedy soaks in a large gold-plated bath. He's staying in the King's Chamber, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a 19th century palace overlooking the River Seine. The deep, steaming waters are easing his back pain, which is worse than ever. He's been touring Paris all day in an open-topped French limousine. Huge crowds line the streets waving to him, everyone wanting to catch a glimpse of the young and handsome President Kennedy and his elegant and sophisticated wife, Jackie. It's the 31st of May, 1961. In just 3 days, the world will be watching as he meets Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. The youthful and charming American president and the fiery veteran Soviet leader.
Between them, a gulf of mistrust, rivalry, and ideological conflict.
Kennedy flies into Vienna in the rain on June 3rd.
Khrushchev arrives on his train later the same day.
A new back medication is working, and President Kennedy nimbly descends the steps of the American ambassador's residence as Khrushchev climbs out of his limo.
This is the story of two men in a crisis that was years in the making. It comes to a head over 13 days in October 1962.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
The rivalry between them culminates in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous nuclear standoff the world has ever seen.
My name is Nina Khrushcheva. I'm the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, who was the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and in 1962 he was the man who initiated the Cuban Missile Crisis.
My name is Maxwell Taylor Kennedy. My father, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, was Attorney General during his brother John F. Kennedy's presidential administration during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was really there at every key decision-making point and wrote probably the first book about the crisis that came out, which is still taught in college. It's called 13 Days.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
Along with others who have studied the story, we're exploring what drove Kennedy and Khrushchev.
To discover what they thought about each other, how close the world came to nuclear war, and what they had to do to pull it back from the brink.
This is The Bomb from the BBC World Service, Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Episode 1, Opening Moves.
So have you ever met any of my cousins or siblings?
Making this series is the first time Nina Khrushcheva and I have had the chance to meet. I was nervous to meet the descendant of a legendary adversary, but it's an opportunity to share stories that have been handed down to us about our relatives, Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy.
So Nina, can you tell me some of your memories of Khrushchev from when you were little, growing up?
Thank you. Well, when I was a little kid, I didn't like going to his country house.
Where was it?
It was about 30 kilometers from Moscow. And it was a small house, and we would go there, but we were always made to collect tomatoes, and he had a beehive, and so we had to go there. And I more remember conversations about how we were misbehaving as children, because it was really boring to be there, and everybody was treating him as if he's God, and sick because he was ousted, because Russian power is forever. And so suddenly you're ousted. What are you doing? Like, you're planting pumpkins and doing beehives. Like, that's unheard of. So it was a very weird environment there. But to us, he was the most fun person in the room. So that's how I remember. But you never met him, right?
No.
Of course, you wouldn't have. But I wonder if your father talked about him.
My father died when I was a child.
Okay, so it wouldn't be.
So it would all be hearsay for me.
So, where do we begin this story? Let's start in 1956. It's the end of February. Hidden behind high fences in a birch forest in the frozen countryside outside of Moscow is the Soviet Union's top secret rocket research facility. My great-grandfather Nikita Khrushchev is being shown around the complex along with his colleagues in the Presidium, the ruling body of the Communist Party. The chief designer, Sergei Korolev, leads them through a large hangar. He is their guide to the past, present, and future of Soviet missiles. First, they admire a full-scale model of the R-2. Khrushchev and his colleagues have seen this one before, 3 years earlier. It was after the death of Joseph Stalin, and in Khrushchev's memoirs, he describes the impact it made on them. "We were like peasants in the marketplace," he writes. "We walked around and around the rocket, touching it, tapping it to see if it was sturdy enough. We did everything but lick it to see how it tasted." But since then, Soviet missile technology has evolved. In the vast hangar, Korolev moves on to the R-5. Khrushchev is impressed. It can carry an 80-kiloton nuclear warhead, the equivalent of 6 Hiroshima bombs, for over 800 miles.
Khrushchev learned to love the bomb. How did this happen? The Soviet atomic project began from August 1945. It became what the Soviets at that time called problem number 1.
Stalin understood the tremendous psychological importance of the bomb, and Khrushchev has picked up what Stalin started, the Soviet atomic project.
The idea was to create a bomb which was important not as a weapon per se, but as a symbol of superpower, of great power. A lot of money was being spent on R&D, research and development, in particular on the space race. Khrushchev recounts how he was given a report written by the head of the Soviet atomic program, which talked about the absolute devastation of nuclear war. And he says that after reading this report, he could not sleep. And then he spoke to the scientists and asked them, "Is this the reality, or are you exaggerating?" And the scientists told him, if anything, we actually understated the impact of nuclear war. So Khrushchev was horrified by them.
Khrushchev often recounted this story. "When I learned all the facts about nuclear power, I couldn't sleep for several days. But then I became convinced that we could never possibly use these weapons. And when I realized that, I was able to sleep again." He was convinced that nobody would be crazy enough to use the bomb. Stepping into a vast, shiny atrium made of glass, Korolev reveals what he calls the future of Soviet rockets. The R-7, It towers above them. At 35 meters tall, the gigantic missile hasn't been tested yet. It is 10 times the size of the R-5 and should be able to travel 5,000 miles. But what Korolev really wants to show Khrushchev that day is a satellite. He wants to get his approval to launch it into space using their latest missile. Khrushchev agrees, but doesn't think it should be a priority. The following year, he will see it differently.
You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
October 4th, 1957. The Sputnik satellite has been carried into space by the R-7 missile. It is the first man-made object to orbit the Earth.
All over the world, people are tuning into the bleep, bleep of the satellite, which carries aboard the highly complicated mechanism necessary to transmit secrets of the universe.
The impact of Sputnik at one level was rather benign. Here was this communist shiny basketball orbiting the Earth. Millions of people went to their backyards to watch this little dot crossing the sky. What alarmed the military was the fear that the rocket that launched Sputnik into space could also be used as an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM as it later became known, to deliver nuclear weapons over the North Pole from the Soviet Union to targets in the United States.
Khrushchev revels in the immense achievement. The new missiles signify great power, superpower status for the Soviet Union, and most importantly, equality with the United States. Parity.
The Soviets may be winning in space, but on the ground, in the summer of 1959, the United States brings its shiny symbols of prosperity to display in Moscow. My uncle, John F. Kennedy, is still Senator Kennedy. This is a year before he's voted in as president. Inside a huge dome in Sokolniki Park, fashion, fast cars, and even an American kitchen are on show to the public. More than 2 million Soviet visitors will file in to stare at the latest American consumer goods over that summer. On July 24th, just as the finishing touches are being put to the exhibits, and before the American National Exhibition opens that evening, 2 important visitors are having a look around: the Republican Vice President, Richard Nixon, and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev.
This, Mr. Khrushchev, is one of the most advanced developments in communication that we have, at least in our country.
Video is one of the new technologies on display, and an operator sets a tape rolling just as a spontaneous debate breaks out between the 2 men. The success of Sputnik still haunts America, and the competition between them, the Soviet Union and the United States, Khrushchev and Nixon, is laid bare.
There are some instances where you may be ahead of us. For example, in the thrust of your rockets for the investigation of outer space. There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you.
Khrushchev, wearing a hat, does not look into the camera. He stares straight at Nixon instead.
You never concede anything.
In what are they ahead of us? Wrong, wrong. We are ahead of you in rockets as well as in this technique. I do not capitulate.
Khrushchev's a unique personality. You have to remember that he survived the terror of Stalin, and he survived the Second World War, and he rose to power from, the poorest of backgrounds, a peasant family. So he really had plenty of hard knocks, and he survived by being the toughest of all of them. He has a charismatic personality. He could bully at times, but he could also, be very charming at other times. And I think he displays this quality that many Russian leaders display of a sense of superiority, a sense of pride in the Soviet Union's achievements, but also a sense of inferiority towards the United States.
Later that summer, after the kitchen debate in Moscow, Khrushchev is invited to visit President Eisenhower in America. It's the first state visit by a Soviet premier and a shock to the rest of the world, given Cold War tensions.
When all the world's been waiting for months to see what would happen when the leaders of these two great power blocs met face to face.
The trip does not ease tensions. Khrushchev wants to visit Disneyland, but Los Angeles police say they can't guarantee his safety there, and the visit is canceled. Khrushchev is furious. He ridicules the United States as an incompetent nation that cannot even protect a dignitary at an amusement park.
Here in New York, Mr. Khrushchev is still stealing all the headlines.
He travels around the country on an exhausting schedule. At a meat packing plant, he enjoys his first American hot dog. No one tells him what's inside it.
Yesterday, he was in the Middle West.
Mr. K looks smarter than we've been used to seeing him. Wearing...
People at the Iowa meeting were just folks. I think that Khrushchev's background sort of put him at ease there.
But the American public are not at ease with the visit.
Well, here in Washington, his original reception was a very chilly one.
Some crowds greet him with silence, even though they've lined the streets to get a glimpse of him. For Americans, he is a communist and a threat.
The next 4 years are going to be difficult and challenging years for us all. The election may have been a close one.
President John F. Kennedy, known as Jack, or JFK, my uncle, though I never met him. In November 1960, he wins the election for the Democrats, beating Richard Nixon in the race to be president.
So now my wife and I prepare for a new administration and for a new baby. Thank you.
President Kennedy grew up in a well-to-do Irish Catholic family from Boston. He was raised in enormous privilege. He embodies America's great youthful promise at the beginning of the 1960s, and he represents the generation of Americans who fought in World War II. He became a war hero when he saved the lives of his crew after his patrol boat was sunk by the Japanese. That heroism becomes an important part of his political story. The war impacts President Kennedy in other ways.
There's this remarkable speech in October 1945. 28-year-old scrawny kid back from the service, getting ready to maybe run for office. He gives a little noticed speech in which he's already concerned about the implications of the atomic weapon, which had just been used on Japan, 2 months before. And he says, basically, I hope our officials' political skill will match our scientific skill in the years and decades to come. If not, we could be looking at Armageddon.
That anxiety does not stop him from calling for more and better missiles during the election campaign. There's a perception that the United States is way behind the Soviet Union in missile production. President Kennedy wants America to catch up.
The bells of the Spassky Tower in Moscow chime midnight to welcome in the new year of 1961. And Nikita Khrushchev prepares to make a toast to his guests. Ambassadors, artists, cosmonauts, and belly dancers are gathered in the opulent St. George's Hall in the Grand Kremlin Palace under 6 huge bronze chandeliers. He raises a glass to peace, telling the assembled crowd, "We hope that the new American president will be like a fresh wind blowing away the stale air between the USA and the USSR." The Soviet premier is pleased that it's Kennedy about to be inaugurated, not Nixon, who Khrushchev really doesn't like. As well as the New Year's toast, he makes several approaches through different channels to try to arrange an early summit with Kennedy. He has a problem that urgently needs solving.
The attention of an anxious world is focused on East and West Germany and Berlin. The last great exodus of refugees from the East is processed in the Marienfelde Center as the communist German regime moves to close their border against...
Khrushchev likes to call Berlin the testicles of the West. When he wants to make the USA scream, he'll squeeze on Berlin. But in 1961, the city is a weak point for him too. Germany has been divided into 4 zones since the end of the Second World War. American, French, and British troops are still in West Germany, and the Communist East is closely tied to the Soviets. As the former capital, Berlin has been carved up in the same way. But the city lies like an island in East Germany, encircled by communism. West Berlin has become a showcase of freedom and capitalism, and also an escape hatch from the east to the west.
People basically can walk across the street or just take the U-Bahn from one part of the city and come out in another part, and they're in the West. And that, of course, creates a huge pressure on the East German economy, which Walter Ulbricht, the communist leader of East Germany, brings up with Khrushchev all the time, saying, look, this is hugely difficult for us. So you have to stop the flow of people. How do you stop the flow of people? Well, you basically take control over West Berlin.
So Khrushchev's New Year toast of 1961 has the feel of a new dawn. But the old problem still stands. He has to stop the exodus from the East. When Kennedy arrives in the White House as president, it is still stalemate over Berlin.
When he enters office, John F. Kennedy is 23 years younger than Khrushchev. In terms of world leadership, he is an apprentice. Khrushchev wants to meet the new president. Kennedy takes a few weeks to respond, and Khrushchev feels snubbed. But they agree to meet in Vienna in the spring. President Kennedy inherits a few international situations, all threatening to erupt. And closer to home, a project already set in motion by the previous administration, a plan to aid counter-revolutionaries invading Cuba.
The military, the CIA, most of his advisors are saying, Mr. President, every reason to believe this will succeed for reasons X, Y, and Z. Kennedy inherits this policy. I think he has doubts. To his everlasting regret, he doesn't really act on those doubts.
The United States has been wanting to bring down Fidel Castro's regime since the Cuban Revolution in 1959. When Castro and his army overthrew Batista, Cuba's right-wing dictator, they seized American assets on the island. And by 1961, Castro is aligning with the Soviet Union. Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Communism has reached the doorstep of the United States. In an effort to remove Castro, the CIA has trained a force of Cuban exiles to invade the island.
And he and 2 or 3 other skeptics basically swallow their concerns. They proceed. It's a foreign policy catastrophe of the first order.
On April 17th, the small invasion force lands at the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba and is annihilated. The president refuses to send in the U.S. Air Force to back up the CIA-trained troops. He does not want it to escalate. More than 100 of the invaders are killed, and more than 1,000 are taken prisoner. The Bay of Pigs casts a shadow over the first months of his presidency and over the upcoming summit with Khrushchev.
I don't understand Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev says to his son Sergei in April 1961. Can he really be that indecisive? Khrushchev looks on in disbelief at the Bay of Pigs. First, that the United States would invade Cuba, and then that Kennedy wouldn't follow through with a plan. In a letter, he warns the American president that the Soviets will help the Cubans defend themselves.
2 months later, President Kennedy will meet Khrushchev face to face. The president knows going into it that he will have to prove himself.
At one point, Khrushchev says of Kennedy that he's young enough to be my son. I mean, on the one hand, he admired Kennedy and was sort of jealous of Kennedy's position as a millionaire who'd made it all the way to the top thanks to his father. But on the other hand, he's contemptuous of Kennedy. And this particularly comes out at the Vienna meeting.
Vienna, June 3rd, 1961. Khrushchev and Kennedy arrive in the city for their first and only meeting as world leaders.
President Kennedy briskly strides down the steps of the American ambassador's residence to shake Khrushchev's hand. He's a picture of youth and vigor beside the elder statesman. There's TV footage of the beginning of one of the meetings.
Khrushchev is laughing, holding court.
It's a test of nerve for President Kennedy. The camera's cut out before the talking really begins.
I think they were both slightly tense, right?
They both seemed tense to me.
And Khrushchev was only, like, there's a little bit of his outgoing persona, but not too much. He's serious.
I think something had happened.